Sometimes it isn't what we see in the woods that matters. I've hunted all my life. I'll probably keep right on hunting until I'm too old and crippled to get myself out there. To be honest, I have never seen anything that I couldn't explain. I can't say the same for the things I've heard. There are always going to be dead trees that fall over, and then there are the smaller critters that make noises outside of their own chatter. Squirrels drop nuts, and raccoons and rabbits scurry around and make scratching sounds. Even deer can make a lot of noises. I know that. Every hunter knows that. And anyone who knows anything about the woods knows what silence means. Usually that means a predator is nearby. It could be any kind of predator depending on where you are. In my neck of the woods, it means bears. So I can explain most of the sounds I hear when I'm sitting 25 feet up a tree in my deer stand. The first time I began to think there might be something out there in the woods that I didn't know about was years ago during a shotgun season. It was one of those frosty, late fall mornings when every step I took walking out to my stand was accompanied by the crunch of frozen grass and sticks and acorn shells and leaves. It was take a step and wait all the way in. Stalking in is generally the best policy, but when there's frost on the ground, it always sounds twice as loud, no matter how nimble-footed you try to be. I got up in my stand just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, and I took a long, deep breath of cool air. There's nothing quite like being alone in the woods. At least I thought I was alone. I was looking out over a meadow waiting for that trophy buck that I knew was going to step out and give me a perfect shot, when I happened to notice a tree in the woods on the other side that looked like it was rocking back and forth. It was a tall tree, and I couldn't swear to it, but judging by its height, I'm guessing it must have had at least a little girth to it. But that thing was rocking back and forth like it was nothing more than a sapling. And then I heard it crack. And there's a sound that a dead tree makes when it snaps that's different from a healthy live tree. This wasn't that sound. The tree I watched sway back and forth, then topple over like it was nothing, was green and alive. I had a lot of questions running through my mind at that moment. I've since come up with a lot of answers. Time does things to our memories. You forget things. You remember things wrong. Sometimes you add things that weren't there. And the farther you move from that moment, the more likely your memory is to be unreliable. And this was a good 30 years ago, so I can't say, or I won't say, what pushed that tree over. All I know is it left me with a lot of questions. A year later, I was sitting in that same stand when I heard a loud grunt from somewhere below me that I also couldn't explain. It wasn't a deer snorting or any other animal that I knew. For one thing, it sounded larger than anything I'd ever heard before. I wriggled around in my stand and tried to see as far around the tree as possible from both sides. I was limited on how far I could see, but I still managed to look quite a ways around. There was nothing out of the ordinary that I could see, but it was at that moment that I recognized the dead silence that comes with a predator's presence. Not even the bugs were chirping. That was followed by footsteps through the leaf matter that littered the forest floor. I could tell it was on 2 feet, so I immediately thought that maybe another hunter was coming through. That didn't make sense because I was on my uncle's property and I knew darn good and well that I was the only person who had permission to be there. And if it was another hunter, he was trespassing. So I called out, "Hey, you down there, you got permission to be out here?" I didn't get an answer, and the footsteps stopped. "Hey!" I yelled again. Still, I didn't get a reply. I sat as quiet and as still as I could for several long minutes, waiting for someone to acknowledge me and hoping it was my uncle. After what must have been 5 minutes or more, I heard the footsteps again. They were moving away from me now, and I figured whoever it was, they must have thought they'd been caught. They decided to move out and avoid a confrontation. I settled back into watching the meadow and had almost forgotten about that person when 3 distinct knocks that I recognized as being wood on wood echoed through the woods from somewhere behind me. What the hell? I mumbled to myself as I swiveled around and tried to get a look in the direction of those knocks. What kind of game was this guy playing with me anyway? But before I could even finish the thought, another distinct set of knocks came from the other side of the meadow, and I spun my head around so fast it almost made me dizzy. And for a minute, I expected to look over at a tree line across the way and see a horde of marauders pouring out. Another round of knocks from my side of the meadow had me spinning around again, and then another, and this went on for a good half hour. I don't know if it was because I couldn't identify who or what was doing it, or if it was something else altogether. I only know that I began to feel sick right about then. Things quieted down a bit, and I stayed up in the stand for a while to get a grip on myself before climbing down and packing up and heading out. I didn't finish hunting that day, and I never hunted that spot again. Years later, I was squirrel hunting on another fall day. It was earlier in the year and it was a lot warmer. Squirrel hunting hadn't been on my agenda that morning when I got up, but I managed to get done with all my honeydews a little early, and it was such a pretty day I couldn't help myself. The sun was already beginning to set in the west when I began to feel like someone was watching me. I stopped at my tracks and I felt the skin on the back of my neck crawl and prickle, and my heart began to beat a little faster from the increased adrenaline flow. I looked around me, scanning closely to see if maybe a deer had snuck up on me and was checking me out, or maybe a coyote or some other critter. Late afternoon shadows cut deep into the foliage, forming a million pockets for curious eyes to look out from, and I couldn't see anything unusual, so after a minute, I started walking again. This time, I heard footsteps that didn't belong to me. They were so nearly perfectly timed to my own steps that at first I thought it was an echo. But there was always one more step that I hadn't taken when I stopped. I listened carefully. I was able to pinpoint the sound as coming from somewhere to my left, and I stopped and I scanned the forest. But night was moving in and the shadows were getting darker and the undergrowth was too dense to make out anything. I decided that it would be a good idea not to take my time. I didn't want to run and trigger any kind of predator instinct, but I didn't want to lose any of the quickly fading daylight either, and I cursed myself for not grabbing a flashlight or a headlamp before I left the house. The steps continued with me, speeding up as I sped up, slowing down as I slowed down. And I looked at my watch and I calculated that I had maybe 15 minutes of daylight left if I hurried, and I'd be at the edge of the pasture leading to the house in 10 minutes. I just needed to keep calm and keep walking. When I started seeing bits and pieces of the field between the woods and my house, I began to feel easier. I even slowed my pace. I figured if whatever was following me had not attacked me yet, it wasn't going to. And I stepped into what was left of that daylight with a huge sigh of relief. And I glanced one time over my shoulder, 10 feet from the tree line, and at that moment, I was hit by a loud scream that radiated through me like a shock wave. Logic and reason left me as I broke into a dead run across that field. I don't even remember stopping to open the gate to the fence that surrounded the house. Maybe I jumped over it. I don't know. I took the steps up into the porch 2 at a time and slammed so hard into the front door that I thought I cracked the glass in the window pane. I had shut the door and I was leaning hard against it, trying to catch my breath when I looked down at my dog. And maybe it was my imagination, and maybe I was projecting my own emotions on that dog. I'll never know for sure. But when he looked up at me, I was certain that he was as scared as I was. Looking back, it may have been a panther, the biggest damn panther that ever walked on 2 feet. But it might have been, or it could have been some other animal that naturally lives in those woods. I never saw anything to indicate one way or the other. There's a reason God gave us 5 senses. If we had to rely solely on our eyesight, we might already be extinct as a species. I've hunted 1,000,000 times on that land since that day, and I've never had another issue. I've heard tree knocks and tree falls and occasional footsteps that sound bipedal and an occasional loud huff. And when I do, I quietly leave the woods and let whatever is out there do whatever it does. I don't need to see it. I don't think I want to.